Thank you very much for attending. What a great crowd. Looking out, I see so many familiar faces, and it's so nice that you could make it today. I first of all want to thank the Senior Center for inviting me here today. I also like to thank Amanda Keck for arranging the whole meeting and asking me to do a presentation today, and also, of course, to FATV for filming the event today so that it can be viewed by a lot of people that couldn't make it. So thanks, FATV. One thing I was thinking about this morning, as I was kind of getting ready, I was thinking, this presentation could only be done in Fitchburg. It can't be done anywhere else, as far as I know, in most of the world. Do you know why? Because no one's willing to sit for an hour and talk about a rock. Oh, this would only happen in Fitchburg. The Rollstone Boulder is your classic glacial erratic. And there are glacial erratics all over New England. And as a matter of fact, not only New England, but the northern states in the United States. There's thousands upon thousands of them. There are many that are much larger than the Rollstone Boulder, scattered throughout the country. And there are thousands that are about the size of the Rollstone Boulder, everywhere. And there are literally hundreds of thousands that are smaller. However, we have something special here. In this case, the Rollstone Boulder is unique. It's unique in the way that it is the only one that has a history and a story behind it. And that's why it is so cherished and so important to us right here in Fitchburg. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you the real history behind the Rollstone Boulder so that you know exactly the story. Are we ready to go? Okay, here we go. The Rollstone Boulder is Fitchburg's oldest historic relic, and its citizens have had an emotional attachment to it ever since its early settlers discovered the giant pebble sitting on the summit of Rollstone Hill. The boulder is shrouded in folklore, mystery, myths, and legends, and throughout its entire history has emerged as an iconic symbol of our city. It would take the better part of this entire day to cover all of its history, so I've narrowed it down to this presentation. Over the course of its life, there have been 3 separate and distinct attempts to preserve this landmark from destruction, with much misinformation and confusion surrounding them. In this presentation, I'll attempt to present these stories one by one in a historically correct and accurate fashion. Let's jump right into the very first attempt to preserve the relic. This is perhaps the earliest known image of the Rollstone Boulder, taken in the early 1880s, showing the boulder in its natural state resting on the bedrock of Rollstone Hill. This rolling stone, trapped under a glacial ice sheet over 1 mile high, is responsible for the naming of the hill. As the last ice age ended about 25,000 years ago, the retreating ice sheets left the boulder somewhat rounded by years of grinding and scraping stone against stone on its journey in this prominent position, directly on Rollstone's summit. To understand why the people of Fitchburg wanted to save this old stone, you have to understand their state of mind back in the day. Even before the first settlers came to Fitchburg, it already had a history, as the boulder was a meeting place and a landmark for Native Americans. Later, as Fitchburg's first settlers arrived, it became a destination, even before destinations were even talked about. As our city grew, its location became a favorite place to hike, have a picnic, or simply enjoy the commanding views and the fresh air. If relatives or friends from outside the city came to visit, this is where you took them. Already a favorite landmark in Fitchburg for over 100 years, it was in the middle of the 1880s when the very first concern about the fate of the Rollstone Boulder surfaced. Visitors to the site began to notice that the boulder had developed sizable cracks and fissures to its surface and thought it might be in danger of splitting apart. The thoughts of the boulder fracturing into smaller pieces didn't sit well with many of our concerned citizens. A movement began to grow to somehow repair and stabilize the stone. Two prominent, civic-minded Fitchburg families heard the cries, collaborated with each other, and stepped forward with a plan. The parties involved were the Litchfield family and the Francis family. Sylvester and Martha Litchfield, with Sylvester's brother Orrin, owned a quarry on Rollstone Hill, and Henry M. Francis was a very successful architect in town. Over time, the Litchfield family owned and operated a series of quarries on Rollstone Hill, and were already quite familiar with the boulder, as it rested directly on the top of their quarry. It was a familiar and welcoming sight to all who worked the hill. The first quarry company the Litchfields were associated with was the Andrews and Litchfield Quarry Company, which later evolved into the Litchfield Brothers, and finally, the Orrin A. Litchfield Quarry. Sylvester and Martha Litchfield and family lived in quite a substantial and interesting-looking house on the west side of the Upper Common, sandwiched between the Norcross and the Battles homes. It had an enormous barn to its rear and gardens that stretched down to the Nashua River. Sylvester's brother Orrin lived just around the corner on Arlington Street. The Litchfield Stone and Land Office was located in a small addition to the right of the home. It is also interesting to note that the family owned the small triangular piece of land directly in front of the house and would one day be named Litchfield Park and would be the final resting place for the boulder. The family donated this piece of land to the city, and although they were part of the very first preservation attempt, they would never see the boulder resting in the park. This house was moved in 1924 to a location on Main and River Streets directly across from the new roundabout in order to make room for a new gas and service station. A service station would operate on that site for 91 years, from 1927 to 2018. The Litchfield home, after being moved to the new location, was later razed. The other half of the party that would participate in the boulder's first preservation attempt was the Francis family. Henry M. Francis was a very successful architect in town who designed many notable buildings in the area. His office was located in the Wallace Block, more commonly called the Sentinel Building in our day. If you look closely at this photo, you can see Henry Francis sitting on the window ledge of his office, to the right of the Francis script on the window. The Francis family lived in this beautiful Greek Revival building located at 231 Kimball Street. This building was once a school called the Lunenburg Academy and stood quite close to Lunenburg Center on Lancaster Avenue. The Francis family purchased the building and had it moved on sleds pulled by teams of oxen to its new location in Fitchburg. Moving this building must have been quite a feat during the day, as Lunenburg Center is approximately 5 miles from this spot. Although still standing on Kimball Street, the building has changed drastically over the years. Some who lived in the area may remember Uskilla service station and variety store that once occupied the site. The large outside clock, placed prominently on the front wall of the building, was a welcoming sight to see for years as one drove over the Rollstone Street Bridge to Kimball Street. So, the Litchfield and Francis families met and discussed what might be the best way to preserve the boulder from further ruin. Their options were limited, but they do come up with a reasonable two-step plan. The first part of the plan would be to fill each crack and fissure on the boulder's surface with a good quality cement to prevent any further damage from the constant freeze-thaw cycles it was exposed to. Secondly, they would have a heavy and strong iron band fabricated that would wrap around the middle of the boulder to prevent any pieces that might fracture from breaking off. This rare, circa 1889 image shows the boulder as it looked before any of the work to preserve it started. They didn't have to go far to find someone to make the iron band, as Franklin Francis, the father of Henry Francis, worked at the Archibald blacksmith shop that was located at that time on the former site of the old Citgo garage just before Lunenburg Center on today's Mass Avenue. Franklin and Henry Francis, together with Sylvester Litchfield, hiked to the summit of Rollstone Hill and carefully measured the circumference of the boulder. A strong, adjustable iron band made in 3 sections and fastened together by large bolts was then made in this shop by the owner, Tom Archibald. Franklin Francis and his grandson, Harry Francis, assisted with the project. Thomas Archibald lived fairly close to this blacksmith shop on Leominster Road in Lunenburg, a home that is still standing to this day. And here is a picture of Thomas Archibald at work in the shop in front of his well-used anvil. He was the local blacksmith in town from 1884 until 1918. It is interesting to note that the town of Lunenburg goes down in history as having a part in the first attempt to preserve the boulder. The iron band fabricated in this shop remained in place for 40 years, from its installation in 1889 until the boulder was blasted apart in 1929 when it was discarded. So, Franklin and Henry Francis, together with Sylvester Litchfield and a select group of helpers, make their way to the summit of Rollstone Hill to the site of the boulder. With all materials in tow, they execute their plan. The deep cracks and fissures of the boulder are filled with cement, and the heavy iron band is installed around the perimeter of the boulder and tightly secured. A sense of relief spreads throughout the community, and visitors waste no time returning to their favorite site. This rare image is one of only a few that show the boulder right after all repairs were finished in 1889. In my years of collecting Rollstone Boulder memorabilia, I was lucky enough to purchase an original glass slide of the relic. It's very interesting to note that the original craft paper envelope has the name Litchfield on it. It's possible that this glass slide once belonged to Sylvester or Orrin Litchfield. The image etched onto this glass slide does fit the time frame and shows the features of the first preservation attempt. Perhaps the Litchfield family hired a local photographer to capture this image and document the repairs. The Rollstone Boulder's very first preservation attempt is now complete. Although the iron band looks somewhat odd on the old boulder, people in town are generally happy to have the rugged-looking band installed and a permanent solution to the old stone's issues in place. The cement that was applied to the cracks, however, does not enjoy the same fate as the iron band, as harsh weather conditions on the summit eventually deteriorate the cement, and in less than 10 years, it is gone. Although the cement would slowly fade away, the number of visitors to the site do nothing but increase. With a renewed sense of awareness and pride in their landmark, people are anxious to say they too have hiked to the summit and climbed to the top of the erratic. People from the surrounding area and even far-reaching locations make it a point to visit the site when in the area. It's number one on things to do in Fitchburg. So, as Henry A. Goodrich wrote in his poem, "The sun sets over Rollstone, as it has for thousands of years, and the people of Fitchburg are satisfied that the grandeur and simplicity of their ancient stone has been preserved." However, little did they know at that time that the boulder would only be safe in this location for a short 13 years before a second and more serious threat to its existence would emerge. 13 years of uninterrupted peace have passed since the Litchfield and Francis families made the first attempt to preserve the boulder. Individuals, couples, and families from Fitchburg and surrounding communities continue to make the journey to Rollstone Summit. Teachers from around the state carry on the tradition of bringing their students to the site to study the geology and mineralogy of the boulder and the hill. But the fate of Fitchburg's favorite landmark was about to take a turn for the worse, and it became apparent that its very existence was again in jeopardy. After enjoying over a century of uninterrupted peace and safety, the boulder's fate was suddenly in danger. The cement repairs of the Litchfield family, done 12 years prior, were nearly worn away from the action of wind, rain, ice, and snow. And the iron band installed by the Francis family was showing its age from the constant thrashing of people using it as a step to climb to its top. The quarry head wall, formed for the constant hammering, drilling, and exploding of the rock, was now within 5 feet of the boulder, and it now was simply an obstacle that had to go. Thousands of dollars of granite rested below its surface, and the quarry owners were determined to claim it. The disappearance of Fitchburg's beloved landmark from the landscape now seemed certain. The land that the boulder rested on at that time was under the control of Jeremiah Shea. Jeremiah Shea was an early and quite successful stone and rock man who leased the land from Ebenezer Bailey. At the turn of the century, Ebenezer Bailey owned much of Rollstone Hill and the surrounding land. Ebenezer's daughter, Anna, became close friends with a girl whose family immigrated to Fitchburg from Germany. The growing German population in Fitchburg had no place of worship at that time and sought to build a church of their own. Anna convinced her father to donate a tract of land on Rollstone Street where they would build the German Congregational Church and a parsonage. Enormous amounts of granite were removed from Rollstone Hill during Jeremiah Shea's tenure. It is recorded that on an average, the combined volume of granite shipped from all Rollstone's quarries out of Fitchburg's Union Station amounted to some 40 carloads a day. This September 6th, 1900 Fitchburg Sentinel article is just one of many that describe the enormous amounts of granite that were regularly removed from Rollstone Hill during Jeremiah Shea's tenure. It is written that Jeremiah Shea was responsible for bringing the first Finns to Fitchburg. Presented with a shortage of hard-working, strong men to work the quarry, he traveled to the docks of Boston to rustle up some men. A steamer from Finland was in port at that time, and he convinced several of the men on board to jump ship and follow him to Fitchburg with the promise of good money and steady work. Many of these new quarry workers, quite satisfied with the opportunities that Fitchburg presented, wrote home urging their friends and their family to join them. Here's a group of Finnish quarry workers at Jeremiah Shea's quarry on Rollstone Hill. The well-dressed gentleman to the front with a chain of a pocket watch showing is most probably Jeremiah Shea himself. Many of these new Finnish immigrants found housing in tenements that were located to the rear of the Rollstone House that was once on the corner of Main and Academy Street. As the Finnish population in that area grew, it became known locally as Finnville. The Finns were not the first group of immigrants to work the quarries. The Irish worked the quarries well before their arrival, and the Irish, for the most part, lived in an area roughly bordered by First Street, Fifth Street, Water Street, and the railroad tracks, an area we commonly call the Patch. The last group of immigrants to work the quarries were the Italians. And as the Irish moved out of the Patch to find better homes, the Italians moved in. Quarry operations continued to proceed at an alarming pace as the demand for Fitchburg stone did nothing but intensify. Jeremiah Shea sent out a warning to the community that quarrying operations could go no further until the boulder was removed from its path. Now just within feet from the quarry head wall, the boulder sat in an incredibly vulnerable position. As word of concern about the boulder's fate started to circulate in the community, a grassroots movement to halt any destruction of the boulder began to grow. Letters with pleas to save the boulder appeared regularly in the Fitchburg Sentinel. Residents expressing their concern approached the Fitchburg Historical Society, and letters, telegrams, and phone calls begging to save the boulder landed on the mayor's desk. However, it was the Fitchburg Historical Society that would take the initiative to help. Charles Fosdick of the Fitchburg Historical Society and president of the Fitchburg Steam Engine Company stepped forward and put into motion a plan to preserve the boulder. At a regular meeting of the Society on April 15, 1901, Fosdick warned that the landmark was in imminent danger of destruction and suggested some action should be taken by the Society to preserve it. On Fosdick's motion, a committee was appointed to contact the quarry owners and report what measures can be taken to secure its preservation. The committee consisted of Charles Fosdick, A.H. Lowe, and J.F. Garfield. This Fitchburg Sentinel article does a great job in summarizing the feelings of Fitchburg's residents at that time. At the suggestion of the Fitchburg Historical Society, John Moran, a building mover and quarry owner, was asked to deliver to the Society a price to move the boulder to a permanent site overlooking the city, where the boulder could not only be showcased, but be safe. No other person in the entire city could have been better positioned to carry through with this task than John Moran. He had the tools, the special equipment, the knowledge, and the experience to move just about any heavy object. Also, being a quarry owner himself, he not only knew his stone, but was also very familiar with Rollstone Hill and its topography. John Moran was very well known in the community. He was a quarry owner, a building mover, a carpenter, a mason, an excavator, a city councilor, an alderman, a mayoral candidate, a contractor, and a developer. He was personally responsible for the development of the Browns lot on Lower Main Street, a vacant piece of prime real estate at the intersection of Main, Lunenburg, and Summer Streets. On the Brown lot, John Moran not only built two substantial apartment buildings, the Moran and the Imperial, but also had his hand in developing the entire square. Because of his investments and improvements here, the city of Fitchburg named this area Moran Square in his honor. John Moran went on to develop many more buildings in the city, including the Crescent on the corner of Blossom and Crescent Streets. There are many in Fitchburg who believe Moran Square was named after Fitchburg's famous baseball player, Pat Moran, of the Cincinnati Reds. However, I regret to inform my West Fitchburg friends that this was not the case. Interestingly, however, he once lived in the square at 7 Lunenburg Street in the Imperial Apartments that John Moran built. The Historical Society suggested that the top of Laurel Hill Cemetery would be a perfect site for the boulder, and Mr. Moran agreed that he could move the boulder whole in the direction of Pratt Road, then through a section of Hazel and Charles Streets to Rollstone Street, then to the cemetery for $500. This December 18, 1901 Fitchburg Sentinel article confirms John Moran's proposal. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon how you look at it, the move never materialized. The Young Fitchburg Historical Society simply did not have that kind of money available to finance the move. To add to the confusion, not all citizens in the city had any desire to preserve or move the boulder. Many people thought that spending money on the giant pebble was just a terrible waste. There were even members of the Historical Society that felt that the rock would lose most of its historical interest if it were disturbed from its original resting place. This interesting article in the May 25, 1901 Sentinel by Professor Henry Bailey summarizes those residents' sentiments. It's interesting to note the proposal mentioned in the previous newspaper article by Miss Warner of Fitchburg State's Normal School had some significant support in the community. Miss Warner's suggestion of allowing the quarry owners to remove the rock around the boulder, but leave enough rock to support the boulder as if it was on a pedestal, was considered a practical, though unusual, option by many. Sympathetic to the outpouring of requests to save the relic, quarry owner Jeremiah Shea signed an agreement with Mr. Moran for the sum of $100 to move the boulder 40 to 50 feet away from the quarry. However, this little-known fact that I uncovered may have been the motivation. When Jeremiah Shea signed the agreement with Ebenezer Bailey to lease the quarry, there was a clause in the contract that stated that the boulder could not be destroyed or damaged. This early photo shows the boulder being prepared by Mr. Moran's crew to move, for the move. Make note of the huge wooden beams that would aid in the move. The Historical Society wanted the boulder moved an additional 100 feet to an area where it would be more safe for many years. And Mr. Moran agreed to move it that extra distance for an additional $200. A counteroffer of an additional $100 was made by the society, but the two parties could not reach an agreement. This absolutely incredible photo, taken in 1902, shows the boulder being prepared by John Moran for the first move on the summit. 25 huge screw jacks were used just to lift the boulder high enough to get timbers under it. Once in the air, a sled of massive timbers would be built under it, and the boulder lowered and cradled on it. This photo may also have an additional historic significance, as I believe the tripod-shaped tool shown on the right is none other than the famous Burley rock drill, invented right here in Fitchburg in 1866. Here is a different view of the same move. You can just make out the start of a sizable wood carriage underneath the boulder. A series of 20 or more wood rollers placed under the carriage or sled, and a team of horses or oxen helped to make these moves possible. Here is the boulder perched on a wooden sled ready to be moved. If you look closely, you can just make out a series of rollers under the sled. On the morning of May 22nd, 1902, the Fitchburg Sentinel reported that Mr. Moran's crew, consisting of 32 men and a team of horses, led by foreman Fred Garvin, proceeded to move the boulder. The boulder was put to rest in this new location before the noon whistle blew. In this newspaper advertisement placed by John Moran in the Fitchburg Sentinel, he wrote in his own handwriting that this first move and second preservation attempt occurred on May 22nd, 1902 at 10:15 a.m. The Fitchburg Sentinel reported on this historic event the same day. John Moran was quoted as saying he was perfectly satisfied with the success of the undertaking. It was noted by several people involved with the move that the granite bedrock all around and under the boulder was crowded with over 75 years of inscriptions chiseled into the rock. Unfortunately, Jeremiah Shea did not waste any time removing the top sheet of granite from the site, and most all of these memories simply tumbled into the quarry pit below. After much discussion, negotiations, and fanfare, the boulder is now resting in its new location, and not surprisingly, visitors return in huge numbers to see the results. This group was there even before John Moran had a chance to remove the great wood beams from the site that were used to cradle the boulder on his sled. The Rollstone Boulder, now in its new position, was now considered safe from future hazards by its admirers. Unsure if he would be involved in future moves of the boulder, John Moran made the decision to prop the boulder up using pieces of granite rather than rest it back on the bedrock. This would make it easy to slip huge wood beams under the boulder that would be used to move it in the future. The boulder's second preservation attempt is now complete. Any image you see of the boulder raised on granite blocks would be 1902 or later. So once again, there is sunset at the boulder, and the people of Fitchburg are satisfied that their favorite landmark has escaped destruction. William K. Bailey, son of Ebenezer Bailey, penned these lines one evening while sitting beside the boulder at sunset. A fitting recap of one man's sentiments of the day. Little did Fitchburg residents know at the time that the boulder would only be safe in this location for 27 years before its last but most serious threat to its existence would emerge. After 27 years of uninterrupted safety on the summit of Rollstone Hill, the boulder's most serious and final threat emerged. The protection of Jeremiah Shea's 40 to 50 foot move on the summit 27 years prior in 1902 could no longer shelter the boulder from harm. There was a new player in town, and his name was Benjamin McAuliffe of the McAuliffe family. And the fate of the boulder, for the third time in his life, was now in his hands. Frank A. McAuliffe of the McAuliffe Quarry Company was the patriarch of the family that included 7 boys and 2 girls. Most all the boys participated in the quarry operations at different points in their life, with his son Benjamin being in control of the boulder's fate at this critical time. At various points in time, there were 6 or 7 different companies working the quarries of Rollstone Hill. But now, for the first time in Rollstone Hill's history, all available granite was under control of the McAuliffe family. Here's a photograph of Ben McAuliffe with some of his family sitting atop the boulder about 1900. Little did he know that in 29 years, both he and the city would be involved in a historic and final effort to preserve the relic. At a meeting of the local Chamber of Commerce, Timothy Shea, a member speaking for the McAuliffe Quarry Corporation, informed the group that the boulder was once again in a perilous position at the quarry's edge and in high risk of destruction. The Chamber of Commerce formed a committee to study the different scenarios that might be used to save the boulder and concluded that the boulder was an encumbrance to progress and it will likely be destroyed. This rare photo from a family's private photo album also shows just what a dangerous position the boulder was in. No one could doubt something had to be done. This front page, August 26, 1929, Fitchburg Sentinel headline, reported that the huge landmark cannot be preserved without prohibitive expense, and the boulder is doomed. There was simply no time or money for a second move on the summit, and the quarry owners wanted the obstacle gone for good. Resolved to this fact, many people thought his fate was sealed, and the historic landmark, which stood its ground for thousands of years, would simply disappear from the landscape. With his mind already made up, Timothy Shea offered to deliver fragments of the boulder to the Historical Society and the Fitchburg Public Library so they might be kept for posterity. The fate of the boulder reached a critical stage on September 3rd, 1929, and this photo shows why. The McAuliffe quarry operations had come within a few feet of the boulder, and they were planning on blasting away the stone underneath it and letting the boulder tumble to its destruction. When word got out to the community of the boulder's expected demise, ceremonies were planned, and hundreds of people were expected to witness the event. The fate of the boulder seemed hopeless, but powerful voices in significant numbers came forth from the community, and the Fitchburg Sentinel became the sounding board for letters and editorials pleading to save the boulder. One exceptional article came from Elizabeth Sleeper, a French teacher at Fitchburg High School. she wrote quite a passionate and persuasive article in the Sentinel pleading to save the boulder. Mayor Joseph Carrier's office was flooded with phone calls, wires, and requests from Fitchburg residents to save the historic landmark. Sentiment and momentum in the community grew and leaned towards saving the boulder permanently by moving it off the hill. Feeling an intense pressure from the community, Mayor Carrier felt he had to act. At the mayor's request to the McAuliffe Quarry Company that he wanted to save the landmark for posterity, the boulder was granted a reprieve, and quarry owner Ben McAuliffe promised cooperation. The third and final effort to preserve the relic was now underway. Soon after the boulder's stay of execution was granted, a special meeting was called by the Chamber of Commerce, President James A. Walsh. James A. Walsh proposed a Rollstone Boulder committee to investigate the possibilities for preserving and relocating the boulder. Mayor Carrier employed 2 expert quarry workers to advise him of different scenarios that might be used to move the boulder to a safe and proper place of rest. The quarry experts agreed that the boulder could be saved by fracturing it, loading the pieces onto trucks using quarry derricks, and then delivering them to the public works yard until a site for its reassembly could be identified. The Rollstone Boulder Committee set up a restoration fund to help finance the boulder's move and reconstruction. The very first contribution was received by John B. Fellows, City Treasurer, from Miss Elizabeth Sleeper in the amount of $25. In total, $385.48 was raised by the community. It's interesting to note that Miss Sleeper was the very first person in Fitchburg to contribute to the Boulder Restoration Fund and a very early cheerleader for its preservation. And she also wrote the words to Fitchburg High School's alma mater. Now, with renewed urgency and a plan in hand, the city dispatched a crew to Rollstone Hill to paint the boulder with reference lines to help in its reconstruction. A series of white lines, red lines, letters, numbers, symbols, and other arrowhead-like figures were used to mark the positions and orientation of the various pieces. This amazing photo from the files of Fitchburg Public Works shows the beginnings of this process. In what would prove to be one of the most incredible pieces of our boulder's history ever unearthed, a gentleman by the name of Steve Jackson stopped in the gallery. He said he knew that I was interested in information concerning the Rollstone Boulder and asked if I'd like to see something connected to it that his family had been saving for years. Steve placed a well-known cardboard mailing tube on the table and started to pull out 4 detailed sketches of the Rollstone Boulder with numerous reference lines, letters, and symbols shown all over the boulder's surface. After studying them briefly, I knew exactly what they were. But more importantly, I understood the incredible historical significance of the items. There in front of me was the original set of drawings that were prepared by this city's engineering department that were used as a plan or a guide to reassemble Fitchburg's historic Rollstone Boulder. Steve Jackson is the grandson of J. Mark LeBlanc, the mason who reconstructed the boulder. Here is the actual engineering department's drawing of the first pick. If you go back 2 pictures and compare it to the photo, it's just about an exact representation. The second photo from the Public Works Department shows a second view of the process with the boulder taking on a garish and gaudy look for the first time in history. People in town said it looked like it was severely wounded and covered with bandages. And here's the matching drawing from the city's engineering department. Again, an exact representation of the photo. This is the third drawing of the markings on the boulder done by the engineering department. Unfortunately, its matching picture has been lost over time. And here's the fourth and final drawing of the boulder. Again, the matching photo is nowhere to be found. This rare photo from a Fitchburg family's private album documents not only the painting of the lines, but also the precarious position of the boulder at that time. This absolutely incredible photo captures a rare moment in the boulder's history. This strong and stately king of the hill that stood its ground for over 20,000 years would soon be reduced to rubble. September 6th, 1929 was set to be the date of destruction. Hundreds of people, children, adults, city officials, crowded the summit to witness the stone's passing. A crew of 5 men from the Call Company under the direction of foreman Niilo Hautinen and blasting foreman Frank Rome failed after 5 black powder blasts to inflict any damage. The boulder refused to yield. The crew then took an entire keg of black powder, poured it into a sack, and stuffed it under the boulder. When the smoke, dust, and debris settled, the boulder barely budged. It stood its ground. Discouraged, the quarrymen stopped work for the day. Returning the next morning on September 7th, 1929, a new plan of attack was implemented. The boulder was on a ledge, and there was a shelf located about 15 feet below. It was thought that if the brow of the ledge was blown apart, the boulder could fall to the ledge below, and its impact would cause the stone to fracture. When the kegs of black powder went off and the air cleared, the boulder slid slightly downhill, but remained whole. Frustrated quarry workers returned with more black powder and blew away more of the ledge, causing the boulder to topple from the ledge and land on the shelf 15 feet below. Workers then swarmed all over the rock with steam drills and bored holes for black powder blasts. These blasts proved to be fatal, and the huge pieces of rock broke away from the boulder. On the morning of September 8th, 1929, additional blasts reduced the boulder to pieces that could easily be carried by a 5-ton truck. Great care was taken to gather all the remnants and place them in a neat pile. The plan was to move the pieces to the Public Works yard. Scrambling for souvenirs, neighborhood children swarmed the pile of rubble and fled with small pieces. Most were apprehended, and they were ordered to stay away from the project. Quarry operations shut down at 4 o'clock, but workers stayed until dark to guard the treasure until police moved in that evening and stayed with the boulder throughout the entire night. Well-known local artist Stella B. Forrest of 138 Marshall Road set up her easel right at the quarry. Taking advantage of the late afternoon sun, she captured the scene in watercolors. The whereabouts of that painting today is not known. The final resting place of the boulder was decided upon on November 8, 1929, in the office of Mayor Carrier. After reviewing letters and telegrams from local businesses and citizens, all 6 members of the Rollstone Boulder Committee were present and included Mayor Carrier, ex-Mayor Marcus Coolidge, State Representative Louis Deschaines, John Fellows, Frederick Currier, and Elizabeth Sleeper. One site that was seriously considered was the lawn to the left of the Historical Society on 50 Grove Street, but this plan never materialized. After much discussion, a small triangular plot of land near the Upper Common was chosen. This plot of land was considered large enough to showcase the boulder to good advantage, offered very high exposure, and had enough parking nearby to allow curious visitors easy access to inspect the specimen to their heart's content. Ironically, the massive monolith would occupy the smallest park in the city, Litchfield Park. To understand how Litchfield Park was born, we have to go back many years to the previously mentioned Litchfield home in the Upper Common. This is the way the site looked 100 years ago. This is the home of Sylvester and Martha Litchfield. They once stood opposite the park. The Litchfields not only owned and operated the Andrews and Litchfield Quarry on Rollstone Hill, they also owned the land in front of their home that we now call Litchfield Park. The Litchfield family donated this portion of their land to the city. Also remember, it was members of the Litchfield family that were responsible for the very first attempt to preserve the boulder in 1889. On November 9th, 1929, Joseph Pierce, Public Works Commissioner, informed the committee that the foundation for the boulder would be completed soon. It would consist of a 6-foot thick concrete slab reinforced with steel rods. Embedded in the slab would be 4 massive granite piers onto which the boulder could be mounted. A search was started to identify a skilled local mason that would be in charge of the reassembly. It was thought at the time that the reconstruction of this boulder was the first project of its type in the entire country and possibly the entire world. There was an undercurrent and feeling of incredible anticipation and celebration by most in the city as the reality of the project finally coming to fruition was anticipated. On May 10th, 1930, Mayor Carrier announced a triple 4th of July celebration, and a party would be planned to celebrate Independence Day, the state tercentenary, and the rededication of the Rollstone Boulder. The mayor got to work planning what he would call the most elaborate celebration in this section of the state. Mayor Carrier ordered 8,000 bronze souvenir coins to be struck and then sold throughout the city to defray the cost of the celebration. The obverse featured the city seal, and the reverse featured the Rollstone Boulder with the dates 1630 to 1930 and an image of the Massachusetts sacred cod. A local mason by the name of J. Mark LeBlanc was identified as someone who had the skills to reassemble the pile of rubble that was once the boulder. This picture shows the young J. Mark LeBlanc. Finally, in June of 1930, a derrick owned by John Moran that once moved the pieces of the boulder from Rollstone Hill was rigged over to the small triangular plot of land in the Upper Common. This derrick would be used by the contractors to unload the boulder fragments and hoist the fragments into position for reassembly. J. Mark LeBlanc immediately got to work on the daunting task. J. Mark LeBlanc was solely responsible for the complex task of reconstructing the Rollstone Boulder. Slowly, and with the assistance of steel rods and cement, the boulder began to assume its familiar shape. But the project was by no means easy. Mark LeBlanc commented on the fact that the job was complicated by the fact that the pieces were not marked and plotted in sufficient detail before the blasting, and that vibrations from trolley cars refused to allow the cement to set. Furthermore, some pieces were either missing, lost, or stolen. Fitchburg resident Teresa Garfield, daughter of James Garfield, the father and first organizer of the Fitchburg Historical Society, sat on the steps of the First Parish Church and faithfully kept a log of the reconstruction. She recorded that 54 major pieces of stone were put back together like a giant puzzle to recreate the massive monolith. As the Great Depression began to take its toll, contributions to restore the rock were hard to come by. Unfortunately, insufficient funds and the difficulty and time involved in preparing the boulder fragments for reassembly put the project behind schedule. It became apparent that it would not be finished in time for the 4th of July celebrations. There were many people in town that were upset and disgusted by the entire project, and it was commonly referred to in town as Carrier's Monument, Carrier's Folly, and because it was falling apart so often, the Humpty Dumpty affair. Nevertheless, on October 15th, 1930, the last piece of the puzzle was placed and the Rollstone Boulder was considered whole once again. On Saturday, November 1st, 1930, Mark LeBlanc stated all that was left was to smooth, carve, and stipple the stone. An announcement in the November 15th, 1930 Sentinel read, "Work on the reconstruction of the Rollstone Boulder is complete." The contours, cracks, and even its orientation are exactly as it appeared on the top of Rollstone Hill. The project had a total cost of almost $5,000, which included J. Mark LeBlanc's masonry work of $364.73. It was a huge success. The third and final effort to preserve the relic was over. The familial bronze plaque, a generous gift from Fitchburg resident Alvin T. Simons, would not be installed until 1937, 7 years later. It's interesting to note that not every fragment of the original boulder that made its way to the Upper Common found its way back into the Great Stone. A rather large piece that would not easily fit back into the interior was placed on the sidewalk on the corner of Main and Prospect Streets by the DPW and sat there for about 10 days. Madeline Gaylor of 5 Prospect Street, a well-known Fitchburg resident, was successful in convincing friends within the DPW to place the leftover piece in her front yard, where it still rests today. An additional 80-pound piece of the boulder was obtained by city resident Mr. and Mrs. Herbert Fredericks of 20 Brown Avenue, owners of the Moran Square and the Pullman Diner. The fragment was donated to the Cathedral of the Pines in Ringe, New Hampshire, in memory of all Fitchburg veterans who died in war. In deciding to part with the fragment, Mr. Frederick said it seemed eminently fitting that it be placed with other memorable stones, as all of the veterans during their youth had visited the rock. So, this is the story of the Rollstone Boulder. It remains today an out-of-place and rarely noticed curiosity. Its epic journey from pre-glacial birth to Depression Day resurrection is long forgotten. Weeds grow out of the deep cracks and crevices, and passing motorists speed by daily without even noticing it, and are for the most part unaware of its history and past struggles. It doesn't light up at night. It doesn't make interesting noises or attempt in any way to attract attention to itself. It just simply exists. Yet, we take some comfort in knowing it's there. It has always been there. In this ever-changing, unpredictable, and volatile world in which we live, it's our personal reminder and symbol of all things solid, all things permanent, all things strong, and all things everlasting. The boulder is an important part of the history and the very fabric of our community. It's just one of the unique chapters in the story we tell. Ultimately, more than anything else, it's a permanent symbol and reminder of the willpower, determination, and resolve of the city and its citizens. This poem, written by former Fitchburg resident Bob Boucher, shortly after the boulder's third and final move, nicely summarizes the sentiments of many Fitchburg residents, past and present. Perhaps next time you drive through the Upper Common and round the boulder, you'll look at this giant stone a little differently and recall its incredible journey from Rollstone Hill to Litchfield Park. I thank you very much for attending, and that's the presentation. Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone have any particular questions? Go ahead. Well, it basically says where it came from and the contributions from the city. And believe it or not, there are two mistakes on the plaque. The first mistake is the plaque claims the boulder came from the Monadnock region of New Hampshire, but it was later discovered that the granite that the boulder contains, it's called porphyritic granite, it's not found anywhere in the Monadnock region, but it is found much further north in the Bradford and Warren area of New Hampshire. So that boulder had a long journey to get down to the summit of Rollstone Hill. Secondly, the plaque claims that the boulder was saved by popular subscription from the citizens of Fitchburg. Fitchburg could raise little money from citizens. And keep in mind, it was during the Depression. People didn't have a lot of money. So the city was the one that really had to chip in and pay the bulk of the cost of moving the boulder. The Rollstone quarries opened in 1825. There were 6 active quarries for the most part on Rollstone Hill, and they closed and they ceased operation in 1941. And they went out of business one by one, and they simply left. They just abandoned. And the city basically ended up owning all of the 95 acres of Rollstone Hill. And the reason that most of the quarries failed in 1941 was because of the widespread use of cement. And cement was it was a cheaper, an easier thing to work with, and stone could not compete with cement.
Do you have any idea how much the stone weighs?
Oh, wow. You know, I actually have that figure, but not up here. It's a very heavy stone, and these derricks, these 75 to 95-foot derricks, that were set up on the top of Rollstone Hill were used to move incredible blocks of granite. Yeah. And of course, anyone that has visited Rollstone Hill is aware that the hill today is still littered with granite everywhere on the hill. Yeah. If you could put a pin in the map at Fitchburg and you could draw out a radius of 40 miles, almost, not all of course, but almost all the granite you see in public buildings and in homes came from Rollstone Hill. The two massive pillars of the First Parish Church came from Rollstone Hill. One-piece granite pillars weighing 20 tons. They were brought down from Rollstone Hill to the O'Connor Stone Yard on River Street, where they were turned on a steam-powered lathe. So they were, any granite you see in Fitchburg is Rollstone Hill granite, but it made it as far as New York City. Rollstone granite is used in every bridge that spans the Hudson River. Wow. So it was big-time business in Fitchburg, the quarries. There was some of you may have been on the rock walk that I do, and there was a home at the base of Rollstone Hill that was occupied by a Henry Shattuck, and Shattuck Street was named after Henry Shattuck, and Henry Shattuck's specialty was making cobblestones, and they would bring scraps down to his doorstep and deposit the scraps there, and he would carve them into cobblestones. For just an interesting side note, for those people that are on Facebook, and I've seen some of the recent posts, a gentleman recently sent me a picture of someone that came from Sweden. His last name was Johnson, as a lot of them were, but the photo had written on the back of it that he saw an ad in an international publication for work at the quarries in Fitchburg and emigrated to the United States specifically to work in Fitchburg's quarries. That was put up on Facebook like 3 days ago. Thank you very much.